Chapter 2, Part 1 of Miss Grantley's Girls, and the Stories She Told Them, by Thomas Archer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Chapter 2, The Silver Goblet, Part 1. There was a time when on rare occasions it flushed with the glow of rare cold wine spiced with fragrant spices, or better still, held the essence of odorous flowers distilled into subtle perfume. Need I say that this goblet is old silver? It was in France that it held a place of honour in the house. That house was one of note in Languedoc, not that its owner was noble by birth, but he was of the great Protestant families, the old Huguenots, whose undaunted spirit Louis XIV could not quell, even with the fortresses that he built to frown them into submission, or with the help of a fierce soldiery. They were troublous times even long afterwards, when Anton Dormeur, owner of looms and manufacturer of velvet, went about with a serious face and trusted few of his neighbours. Anton Dormeur was a man who kept his own counsel, and when the persecutions had for a time been stayed, he saved money, hoping to rebuild the fortunes of his house for those two daughters, who were but children when his wife died, and left a vacant place that never could be filled. They were lovely, these girls, each in a different fashion. The elder, tall, slender, dark-haired, haughty, with the complexion of a peach; the younger, soft and fair, with locks that hung like silken skeins upon a neck of snow, and eyes of that dark changeful sheen that is either grey or black, or blue, as you seek to look into their depths. Hers were the plump white fingers that pulled the delicate rose leaves with which this cup was filled, till the air of that gloomy room was fresh with the odours of a garden after an evening rain. Mathilde, her dark proud sister, loved lilies best, and set them in a jewelled vase. That vase perished in the great calamity that fell upon the house, and the silver cup was among the few relics that were saved. Alas! The beautiful, imperious Mathilde perished also in those evil times. Yes, this beautiful creature, whose coming seemed to lighten the dim room in the old chateau with its hangings of amber damask, its gilded panels framed with long slips of looking-glass, its satin chairs, its quaint carved cabinets filled with rare knick-knacks of ivory carvings, jade stones, jewelled daggers, boxes of filigree, and rare cups of porcelain, like great opals, gleaming with strange lights that paled the pearls with which their rims were set. There were tables and tripods too, bearing bronzes and oriental jars filled with scented woods and spices. But it was over this silver cup that the sweet glowing face of Sarah Dormeur bent, as she stood watching for her lover's fluttering signal amidst the trees that belted the sloping parterre beyond the broad stone balcony on which the windows opened. For the father, Anton Dormeur was averse to young Dufarge, who, though he belonged to a Protestant family among the tanners of Alais, was a man of the people, without that connection with the old nobility which the Huguenots cherished, even though they suffered continually by the laws that king and nobles put in force against them. The Protestants were loyal to the caste which yet refused to own them, though they were of the best blood in France, or owned them secretly and in fear, lest to be identified with the heretics might bring fire and sword upon themselves. Thus old Dormeur forbade Sarah to have any more to say to Dufarge, but encouraged the lover of his eldest girl, a man of twice her age, the grim and saturnine Berthold, by birth seigneur of an estate near Lozère, where, however, he lived only on sufferance, for the title had been abated after the persecutions following the Edict of Nantes, and though Berthold was rich, he had abandoned both title and the display that belonged to it. he was just an alliance as the stately reserved manufacturer might have been supposed to choose for his eldest daughter, and indeed after they were married he would go and stay for days together at his son-in-law's house, a place less gloomy for him now that the light had gone out of his own. For Sarah, having pleaded in vain, fled with her lover to the north, and there they were married. After this they hoped and believed that the old man would relent. He never relented, or at least never to their knowledge. As his sweet fair daughter knelt to him, her golden hair streaming about her, her hands held up in supplication, he denounced her in words taken from Holy Scripture, and would have struck her but that the young husband stood with earnest eyes and folded arms, he having knelt in vain, or, as he said, bent his pride to his love for his sweet wife's sake. So Sarah Dufarge went out cursed, undowered, and an orphan, from the old house, and Père Dormeur was left desolate indeed. Yet amidst the gloom that settled on his life, and the hard unyielding determination which resisted any attempts on the part of her sister to bring him to receive his disowned daughter again, the manufacturer had frequent struggles with his pride and obstinacy. They were scarcely acknowledged even to himself. He thought he could trample the suggestions of nature under foot, and he succeeded in so far as to suffer in silence, and to make no sign of yielding, nor of admitting the possibility of foregoing his resentful purpose. He had much to occupy his thoughts at that time, for there were rumours of renewed persecutions of the Protestants by command of bishops and clergy. Not contented with refusing them the legal registration of marriage and the certificate of death, it was said that a general confiscation of property was ordered, and that recantation or death by fire and sword might once more be the doom of the sectaries. Anton Dormeur was frequently at Alais with Berthold, and the people there whispered that it would go hard with the manufacturer when the dragoons came. He had already made some preparations, however. Always in communication with the refugees who had settled in Spitalfields and Coventry, he held money in England. This was pretty well understood, but what few people knew was, that for weeks before the blow fell he had had a ship ready, and that some of his most valuable effects and merchandise were stowed among the cargo. This very cup was hidden away in a case, surrounded by silk brocade and velvet, clothes and lace. For days the vessel swung with the tide, waiting for Anton Dormeur, who sought to bring his daughter Mathilde and her husband with their child to be his companions in flight. But Bertholde delayed, loath to part from the farms and land that were his birthright. He and his little boy, the first and only child, were on a visit to the old lonely house and its grey master, when a messenger, his horse covered with blood and foam, came thundering at the door with the fearful intelligence that the alarm was ringing at Alais, and that the persecutions of the Protestants had begun. Berthold was in the saddle in a minute. "Stay for nothing, but bring my daughter. Come on straight for your lives to St. Jean," cried the old man. "There will be post horses there, and I will order relays along the road where the people know me. Meantime I will take the boy. He will be safe with me." They never met again in this world. Berthold died fighting on his own threshold. His wife, the beautiful Mathilde, perished, perhaps in the flames. At all events, a wild figure was seen at an upper window just before the great leaden roof of the chateau curled and fell. Fire and sword spread in a widening circle round that district. The house of Anton Dormeur was sacked. Achille Dufarge and his wife, the lovely Sarah, were in Paris, where no word reached them till long after, and then only by a stranger, an old workman of the factory in Languedoc. So the months went by. And then came the awful revolution that put an end to the royal family, and enthroned the guillotine. Then the revolution passed out of the hands of men, and the destinies of France seemed to be in the keeping of murderers like Robespierre and Couthon. By that time the old man and his grandson were in England, the boy having grown to be a tall and handsome youth. On the doorposts of a tall gaunt looking house in a street of that strange part of London lying between Spitalfields and Norton Folgate, and known as the Liberty of the Old Artillery Ground, might be seen the words A. Dormeur, Silk Manufacturer. It was a dim looking place enough, where the yellow blinds were nearly always drawn over the front windows, and the summer's dust collected in the corners of the high flight of steps, and was blown round and round in little eddies, along with bits of string and snippings of patterns or shreds of silk and cotton. The front door stood open every day from 10 till 5, to give buyers access to the warehouse, in which Anton Dormeur, old, withered, slightly bent, and with a set look upon his face which even his rare smiles failed to disturb, unrolled pieces of silk, made bargains, examined with a critical eye and with the aid of a magnifying glass the fabrics brought in by the weavers, and in fact carried on his trade as though he had for ever been separated from the tragedy which befell him in Languedoc nearly 14 years before. And yet that heavy affliction darkened his mind as he rolled and unrolled his silks, or carefully matched the skeins that came from the dyers. The sun was shining through the windows, the lower panes of which were dulled in order to obtain a clear high light, but the cloud upon his puckered brow was not lifted. Hour by hour the warehouse clock ticked away the afternoon. Customers departed. The sound of the scale and the clatter of reels and bobbins in another warehouse beyond the long passage had ceased since midday. Presently some passing thought, too bitter for absolute self-control, crossed the old man's mind, and he bowed down his grey head for a moment upon his folded hands, but the next instant glanced round with the half-startled look of a man who fears he has betrayed himself. He was busy over his patterns again, as he noted that a young man at the other end of the room was regarding him with a wistful, pitying look. "Come, Antoine," he said, "you have had a long day's work, and we dined early. It is time you had finished your ledger for the day. Come and help me put up these pieces, and then get you into the fresh air. Would that I could make the old house more cheerful for thee, boy, but remember it is all thine own one day, and do not add to the sorrows of the past anxiety for the future." The young man had come to his side, a slender, handsome fellow, with an olive cheek, curling hair, and a dark eye, both frank and fearless. "And you, grandpère," he said, touching the old man's hand, "why will not you go out and seek some change from your dull life? What sorrow is it that seems to press so hard on you today? And why do you think it necessary to give me words of warning? What shadow has come between us?" "What shadow?" echoed the old man, peering at him from under his bent brows. "None of my throwing, boy. But do you forget what day it is? A dark anniversary for me, if not for you, and I scarcely thought you would have let it pass without a thought. Nay, I need not wish its darkness to lie on you for ever either. But, Antoine, remember, you are all I have left. In my silent, lonely life and this dull house, and I always a reserved and seeming loveless man, you may well pine for something more, some lighter, gayer time, and ever brood over the means to find it. But remember, my son, that you are by birth above the paltry pleasures of the herd, that you can come to me and ask for money if you covet some pastime that befits you, that you need conceal nothing from me, have no friend that I may not know also." Antoine's face flushed for a moment. It was seldom indeed that his grandfather spoke in a voice so tender and so yearning. Almost insensibly his arm stole round the old man's neck. "What is it?" he said again. "What have I done?" "I accuse you of nothing, lad," replied his grandfather, gently disengaging himself. "I thought perhaps your tastes may have needed more money. You do not gamble, Antoine. You are never out late, for I can hear you come in, and the sound of your violin penetrates to my room, so that I know when you are at home. I don't expect you to be always with me. I would not have it so. But when you want money—" "Grandfather," said the young man hastily, "I know not what you mean. Have I ever asked you for more than the allowance you make me? Do I complain? Except for the 2 or 3 bills that you have paid for me of your own free will, do I exceed your bounty?" "Talk not of bounty, boy," said the elder, flushing in his turn. "Antoine, could you read my heart, you would see that all I desire is to show to you the love that the world would give me no credit for, that my own children, even thy mother, Antoine, and Sarah. Ah, leave me just now, my dear. I am surely growing old and childish, but I have still enough of the old manhood left not to wish even my grandson to witness my weakness. Leave me, boy, and let us meet at supper in my room. I shall go out presently to see old Pierre, and if I can to bring him home with me. Poor old faithful Pierre." The young man slowly left the warehouse and ascended the stairs into the house, when he shut himself in his own room and flung himself into a chair in profound dejection. He had scarcely done so when a man came from the upper warehouse, a room whence silk, both warp and woof, was given out to the workpeople to be wound on bobbins or spread into the web before it was fixed in the loom. After every such operation this silk was brought back to be reweighed, and only when the piece was finished in a woven fabric did it find its way into the lower warehouse, there to be measured and inspected. Access was gained to this upper warehouse by a door in a back street, inscribed with the words "A Dormeur, Weaver's Entrance," and thence the workpeople, of whom there were many each day, waiting their turn, went across a paved yard and into a passage terminating in a kind of square lobby, at the bottom of the deep well which lighted the gloomy staircase by a glazed window from the roof of the house. Close to this lobby was a sliding panel, opening on a counter where the great scales hung for weighing the silk, and here weavers and winders gave in or took out their work from the scale foreman, whose name was Bashley, one of those bad men who, with a bullying pretence of candour and honesty, contrive to impose even on the victims over whom they tyrannize, and at the same time, as it were, wrest from their superiors the acknowledgment that they are rough diamonds. By a horrible fiction it is often thought that such a man is just fit to deal with workpeople. The same opinion prevailed then, and thus Bashley was able to get a character which obtained for him a place in the warehouse of Anton Dormeur. He had been there for some 12 months, in place of old Pierre Dobree, a faithful fellow who had joined his old master in London after the calamities which drove them both from France. Pierre had been in Paris, and had escaped to bring to his master the awful intelligence that the daughter he had denounced was now beyond his relentless anger. But the old man, having grown old and feeble, had retired with a pension to the French hospital which then stood in St. Luke's and was called La Providence, a refuge founded to receive poor Protestant émigrés, mostly aged men and women, who had their little rooms quaintly furnished with their own poor household goods, and who walked daily in the quadrangle laid out in beds and borders. Bashley had been only 15 months in Dormeur's service, and yet he had come between the grandfather and Antoine, suggesting suspicions of the young man's probity, but so artfully that while he only seemed to hint at small blemishes, which he pointed out for the sake of the lad's future welfare, he left so much to be inferred that the old man had already a new trouble added to his load. Bashley's insinuations, when analysed, came in effect to charging Antoine with small peculations in order to increase the amount of his allowance, to taking beforehand what he, of course, might consider would be his own some day, as the scoundrel would have put it. Not only this, but he hinted at low companions, at a secret love affair with a girl far beneath him in station. Of this he would, if necessary, furnish proof. It was with a troubled heart that Anton Dormeur, having at last escaped from a whispered conference with Bashley, locked up the warehouse, and went slowly out towards Shoreditch, on his way to the Providence. Old Pierre had been the early guide, philosopher, and friend of the little orphan boy, and the keen-faced, pippin-skinned old Frenchman had the courage of his convictions, and roundly swore many innocent French oaths that afternoon, when his old employer and present patron and friend paced with him along the path of the old quadrangle and told him his suspicions. "So that man of plague, that Bashley, is at the bottom of this also," he said presently. "Why did you send me away and take that liar, that ventrebleu, that hyena?" "But what should it be true, Pierre? My heart is very heavy." "I tell you it is not true." "But about the girl, he said he could prove it, and yet the boy came and rested his hand upon my shoulder to day as if he were candour itself." "Let him prove it." "He swears he will." "What then?" "What then? Do you, too, think it is possible to be?" "I think it is quite possible that Antoine may be in love, and in love with one who is poor, but not ignoble. No, never, not ignoble." There was a strange light in the old foreman's eyes, a strange look in his face, as he said this, so that Anton Dormeur stopped him suddenly. "Pierre, you know something of this," he cried. "You shall tell me. What does it mean?" "I am not sure that I can tell you," replied the old man thoughtfully. "Still you invite me to sup with you tonight. Antoine will be there?" "Ah, there again! This man Bashley told me as one proof of his knowledge that even tonight, this night that I have bidden him to meet me, Antoine will not be at home, that he may stay away altogether to avoid my questioning, that he will certainly disappoint me for the sake of this girl with whom he has an engagement. How then?" Pierre was silent for a moment. A troubled look puckered his face. Then a keen sudden gleam of surprise and intelligence seemed to shoot across it. "You said supper at 9, did you not?" he said quietly. "Yes, the nights are dark." "Make it 10, nevertheless." "Agreed, but why? And what is there working in your brain, Dobree?" "Never mind, monsieur, but lend me 1 or 2, 3 sovereigns." "Pierre, you are extravagant. What can you want with them? There will be no company. Your dress is good enough." "There will be Master Antoine, perhaps a lady, but that I cannot tell. There may even be 2 ladies." "Pierre, it is ill jesting," said Dormeur, turning pale and with an angry glance. "Do you remember what day it is?" "Good heaven, master, forgive me. I had quite another thought than of the day. Pardon me 1,000 times. Pardon me. I could cut out my thoughtless tongue. And yet, believe me, I meant, never mind what I meant." They had reached the passage leading to Dobray's queer little oak panelled room, and as the door was open both the old men entered, Dormeur walking up to the mantelpiece, and fiddling about there with some old china cups, and other little ornaments with which it was adorned. Turned with its face to the wall was a small trumpery frame, containing as it seemed some common looking picture, and quite absently, and as though he scarcely knew what he was doing, the old man placed his fingers on it to turn it face outwards. Anton Dormeur gave a low cry, and placed his hand upon his companion's arm. "Where did you get this?" he said slowly, looking his old foreman in the face. "It is not old. It cannot have been painted more than a year, and yet, as a mere likeness from memory, it is wonderful. Who could have done it? Not you, Pierre, that is impossible." Dobree had recovered himself. "You know that I came from Paris," he said, with his eyes cast down. "You know too how a picture may be retouched and made to look like new." "But you are deceiving me. This is no retouching. It is clumsy, coarse, and except in the evidence that the face itself must have been beautiful, not a good likeness. You wonder I can talk so calmly of this, a poor resemblance of the bright fair girl, of my Sarah, mine, although... Dobree, tell me how you came by this." "I will tell you to night," muttered the old man. "I swear to you that I will tell you to night." "And to night I will show you a portrait on ivory, one that will make you think you see her as you once knew her, Pierre. A picture I keep among some relics, and look at often, oftener than you think, or anyone in the world could guess. Good bye, or rather till 9, no, 10 tonight. Au revoir." When his grandfather had left the house, Antoine, who was restless, unhappy, and full of vague surmises, sat for some time with his head in his hands, and at last only roused himself with an effort. It was growing dusk already, for autumn had given place to winter, and the days were short. There was still light enough, however, for him to see to write a letter, and in a few lines he told his grandfather that he should be with him at 9 o'clock, and would then ask him to give him back the confidence that once existed between them, or to charge him with the fault that he had committed. He felt how vague this was, and almost hesitated, but he carried the letter to the sitting room, nevertheless, and opening the door gently advanced towards the table. It was a large barely furnished room, and yet not without evidence of luxury, or at all events of ornament. The great carved chimney piece was surmounted by an old mirror with sconces containing candles. A leathern chair was drawn up to the hearth. On the table itself was a silver standish with writing materials, and a tall goblet of Venetian glass, while some rare china stood on a cabinet near the window. Antoine so rarely entered this room except at night, and to bear his grandfather company for an hour or two before bedtime, that he involuntarily glanced round it now in the fast fading twilight. In that moment he remarked that the door of the cabinet was unlocked, a circumstance so unusual that he went towards it and looked inside to note what might be the reason of such carelessness. Then, seeing this silver cup on the shelf, he carried it to the window and looked curiously at its contents. There was some reason for his doing so. In that dim silent room, where only its master came daily, and the one domestic who, with an old housekeeper, attended to the wants of Dormeur and his grandson, and did a little dusting once a week, the silver cup had become the receptacle of small trinkets of coins and quaint pieces of jewellery. It was a common custom for the old man to take it out of the cabinet when his eyes were tired with reading, and to turn over these tarnished treasures, some of which were in small morocco cases. To one of the latter Antoine's attention was directed, for it lay open as though it had been hastily placed there, and covered with a piece of torn point lace. Removing this, the young man saw a portrait, the picture of a face so sweet, and eyes so penetrating, that he uttered an involuntary cry. It was a deeper feeling than mere surprise or admiration that prompted it, however. His hand trembled as he replaced the miniature, after gazing at it with an expression of mingled wonder and terror. At that instant the watchman passed crying the first hour after dark, and carefully replacing the cup, he turned the key in the cabinet door and hurried from the room. Now all of my story that remains to tell took place in the next 3 hours, after Antoine left the house with a strange sense of wonder and confusion in his mind. So I must explain a little the situation of the young man, the enmity of Bashley. It had happened then, some months before, that Bashley being away for a day's holiday, Antoine took his place at the scale, for it was a slack time, and few work people were there to be served. He believed he had given out the last skein of silk, and had weighed the last bobbin, so shutting the slide and putting up the bar, he unlocked an inner door, and went into the house and up the stairs. Pausing on the first landing, as he frequently did, to look thoughtfully over the balustrade and down the well staircase, he became aware that one person yet remained quietly seated on the bench below. As he uttered some slight exclamation at his own negligence, a face was turned upward towards his own, a face of such sweet, pure, girlish beauty that he held his breath lest it should be bent from his searching gaze, as indeed it was, but not before the plain straw bonnet had fallen backward, and left a wealth of sunny hair glowing beneath the light that shone down upon it. A confused sense of some picture of an angel upon Jacob's ladder, that he had seen in an old family Bible, came into Antoine's thoughts as he stood and looked, but in another moment the girl had replaced her bonnet, and with her face bent down sat waiting as before. In a minute he was beside her. "Pardon me," he said, with an involuntary bow. "I thought every one had gone. What is it that I can do for you?" There was no embarrassment except that of modesty as she courtesied before him. She might have been a young duchess by the frankness with which she met his look. "I come from Marie Rondeau," she said, "who has sprained her foot and cannot walk. Mr. Bashley said she might send for the money due to her if she was still lame." "Your name is, then?" he inquired, pausing for her to fill up the question by her answer. "Sarah Rondeau," she said simply. "It is for my aunt that I come. I live with my aunt." "And Bashley, has he visited you to bring you money?" Already the lad felt a short jealous pang, but knew not what it was. "He has been to measure our work, but not to bring money. My aunt comes here herself." But Bashley had been there, and the image of this young girl had roused his sordid fancy. Is it a wonder that he soon began to hate his young master? Antoine felt the warm blood in his face as he wrapped in a paper the few shillings that were due. "Do not come again on such an errand," he said. "I will call and see if your aunt is better, and will, if necessary, bring some more money myself." There is little need to say that Antoine kept his promise. That merry bustling little Marie Rondeau, how unlike her niece she was to be sure, was in a constant tremor when the little wicket gate of her garden clicked, and she, looking through the leaden casement of the upper room, saw the young master coming along the little path, with its 2 rows of oyster shells dividing it from the gay plots of gilliflowers, double stocks, and sweet williams. She trembled too for the peace of the fair girl, who had too soon learned to know his footstep and to flush with pleasure at his approach. Already trouble seemed to threaten them, for Bashley had warned her, and in a coarse insolent way had said he meant to be Sarah's sweetheart himself, or they might seek work elsewhere. One night when Antoine entered the garden he was surprised to find old Pierre Dobree there. "You must come no more yet, if you would spare this child from sorrow," he said, after talking long and earnestly. "Your new foreman watches you, and already hints to your grandfather that you are engaged in some mean intrigue. You bring evil where I would have you do good, Master Antoine. Come no more, I entreat you." "And Sarah, does she wish that also?" said the young fellow, reddening. "I have never spoken a word to her that could not be said before her aunt. Why do you interpose, Peter Dobree?" "Excuse me. The aunt is my cousin, the child my ward, and I know your grandfather well. For a month you must not come, but trust me, and give me your word, and all may yet go well." So it was a month since Antoine had been to the little house in Bethnal Green, and in all that slack time neither Sarah nor her aunt had been to the warehouse for work or money. But on that night when Antoine was to sup with his grandfather, the month's probation was at an end. Even had it not been, he would have felt that he must break his promise, for on that very morning, as he stood at the door after the warehouse had been opened, a boy ran up and placed a note in his hand, a mere slip of paper, on which was scrawled, "Will you never come again? S. R." His sensitive nature was shocked at such summons, and for the first time he had a sharp pang of doubt whether he was not to be awakened from a foolish dream. It was with a heavy heart that he bent his steps along the narrow tangle of streets that lay between his house and the edge of a great piece of waste ground known as Hare Street Fields, and even had he been less preoccupied he might not have noticed that he was followed by two men, who kept close to him in the shadows of the houses, and walked as noiselessly as cats, and with the same stealthy tread. Mrs. Rondeau was sitting in her lower room, sewing by the light of a weaver's oil lamp which hung from a string fastened to the mantelpiece. The place was very bare. Few of the little ornaments that usually decorate even a poor home remained, and the good woman's eyes were red with recent crying. The loom in the upper part of the house was empty, and so was the cupboard, or very nearly so. "There goes the quarter," she said, as she heard the chiming of a distant clock. "I wish I'd gone myself instead of sending the poor child. What would Peter say if he knew? Ah, and what would that old flinty hearted wretch say if he knew? How I wish she would come, even if she came back without the money." The night had set in gloomily enough, as Sarah Rondeau went quickly through the now almost deserted streets on her way to a dim shop where three golden balls hung to an iron bracket at the door, to show that a pawnbroker's business was carried on within. It was not the first visit she had made to this establishment, for the poor little household ornaments, the loss of which had left her home so bleak and bare, were now in the safe keeping of the proprietor, but still she shrank back as she approached a dim side entrance in a narrow street, and drawing her bonnet closer over her face, pushed open a baize door, and entered a dark passage divided on one side into a row of narrow cells, separated from each other by wooden partitions. She made so little noise, and still kept so far back in the pervading gloom, that her presence was unnoticed by a shabby looking man who was just then engaged in earnest conversation with somebody in the next box. Before she had spoken, and while she was yet in the shadow of the partition, she thought she recognized the voice of the person who was speaking as that of Bashley, and held her breath to listen, for a name was mentioned which sent the blood back to her heart and made her feel sick and faint. "Well, as long as everything's safe," said the pawnbroker's assistant, who leaned his elbows on the counter so that his head was close to the partition. But we've got a good deal here now, you know, and if the thing should be found out—" "Yeah, who's to find out?" retorted Bashley. "I tell you everything's ready, and the risk's mine. Old Dormer's half childish, and as to the young one, I'll tell you he's safe enough for a week, if I like to keep him so. He'd an appointment to supper with the old man to night, and he won't keep it. If he's not on his way now to see the girl, he's tied up neck and heels by this time, and in a safe place out of harm's way. I tell you I can be back here in an hour or two. You're too deep in it now to draw back, and besides, who can swear to raw silk? I shall go first and look after the girl. Then I mean to call on the old man and send him out on a wild goose chase. The rest's easy, for I've a key, and a light cart at the back of the warehouse will bring the silk here in no time. The game is in my hands now, and I shall play to win." "But when the young one tells his version of the story?" "How can he? He comes out without knowing where from, and if ever he did, he's been in an empty house. A pretty story! No, no, if the old man believes it, he won't face the disgrace, for he more than half suspects his grandson as it is. Come now, will you or won't you?" Sarah Rondeau, crouching by the door, hears this with an undefined fear which paralyses her for a moment, but leaves one thought in her troubled mind. Some foul plot is hatching against Antoine, and she is powerless to hinder it. No, one thing she can do, if only she can creep back unnoticed. She will use all her strength to reach Mr. Dormeur's house and tell him what she has heard. It is a question of minutes. Walking backward and pressing slowly against the noiseless door, she slips out again, and like one pursued begins to run at her utmost speed through the darkened streets. End of chapter 2, part 1. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 2, Part 2 of Miss Grantley's Girls and the Stories She Told Them, by Thomas Archer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Chapter 2. The Silver Goblet, Part 2. Anton Dormeur sits alone in the grim old house. Cook and housekeeper have gone to market for the means of providing supper. Not a footfall sounds in the street, only the wailing voice of the watchman, calling the hour at a distance, breaks the dead silence, amidst which the old man can hear the ticking of the gold repeater in his pocket, the tinkle of the ashes that stir in the old wide grate, where a fire has been lighted, and the gnawing of a mouse behind the wainscot. He sits with the silver goblet beside him on the table, his knees towards the fire, his furrowed face quivering as he bends it down over the miniature he has taken from its case, the miniature of his younger daughter, dead and, no, not unforgiven, dead and mourned for now, with a silent grief that speaks of years of desolation and remorse. The light of the shaded lamp falling on the picture in his hands seems to expand its lineaments. The tears that gather in his eyes almost give quivering motion to the face before him. A strange emotion masters him. His temples seem to throb, his hands to shake. The sudden sound of a light single knock at the street door sets his nerves ajar. The quiet click of the lock, a pause of deadest silence, and then the light tread of an uncertain foot upon the stairs make him tremble. Yet he knows not why, does not even ask himself the reason. There is a lamp outside upon the landing, he knows. The light of it shines down into the hall. and yet he cannot stir towards it. What superstition holds him? Even at the moment that he starts up from his chair, the portrait still in his hand, his highly strung senses enable him to hear a rustle that sounds quite close, and is followed by a low knocking at the door of the room itself. In a voice of hope, of dread, of fear, he knows not what or which, he hoarsely cries, "Come in." In the mirror above his head he sees the room door partly open, and then, yes, then, either to his waking vision or in disordered fancy, the living original of the picture stands with pale and earnest face in the upright bar of light that streams in from the landing. His daughter, not as he had last seen her, but with a difference unaccountable if he had had time to think or strength to reason. His daughter with the past years rolled back to show her in her youth, and yet with poor and scanty dress, and long fair hair tossed in confusion on her shoulders, whence a battered bonnet hung. He had no time to note all this at first. He only knew that his heart seemed to be going out in some dumb movement towards this apparition, that he sank again into his chair, that he felt a living hand upon his shoulder, saw a frightened face looking into his. Then his senses came back, and he heard the voice speak rapidly, and in French. With swift steps, but without picking his way, taking the nearest road rather by habit than by any observation, Antoine Dormeur traversed the narrow streets leading to his destination. There were so few people abroad that the way was clear enough, and yet there were some apprentices or work lads on their way home, while in that neighbourhood, just on the edge of Spitalfields, a lower colony of petty thieves and receivers kept up the trade of 2 or 3 disreputable taverns, where dogs, birds, and pigeons were exchanged or betted on. It may have been in consequence of this taste for pigeon flying that the whole neighbourhood resounded with whistles and bird calls. Men and boys gave each other this shrill greeting as they passed, or warned each other by it, or used it to express reproach or pleasure, hilarity or dismay, varying its peculiar note to suit each emotion. The Hare Street whistle was as well known an institution there as the yodel is to the Tyrolese peasant. It scarcely surprised Antoine, therefore, when, as he reached a beer shop, the last lighted house before the straggling street opened into a dirty lane leading to the open fields, a man who was just emerging from the place gave a low whistle as he turned in the opposite direction and crossed the road. Had he given the matter a thought, he might have hesitated for a moment before plunging into the gloom of the muddy lane, or at least might have grasped his walking cane more firmly and looked about him, in which case it is just possible he would have seen 2 shadows that moved in the darkness of the wall, some 50 yards behind. As it was, he did neither. The course of his gloomy thoughts was unbroken by so trivial an interruption, and continued to be so till he approached a corner where a high ragged fence turned off on the edge of a footpath. Only a sudden scuffle, a muttered oath, and the grasp of 2 powerful arms that pinioned his elbows to his side awakened him. 3 men had leaped out from the projecting corner of the fence, where a light cart was drawn up, and were upon him before he could raise a hand. But he was quick and active, so that by a sudden turn and trip he bore to the ground the fellow who held him, and fell upon him heavily. "Give it him, and quick there with the sack!" cried this worthy, as they rolled on the path together. Another ruffian seized Antoine by the throat. A weapon gleamed before his eyes. But in that moment a quick patter of feet sounded in the roadway, followed by two reports like the sudden breaking of a cocoanut. Crack, crack, and the ruffian's body fell heavily against the fence, as two shadows, the two shadows that had been following Antoine so long, danced in the footway, whence they had just struck a second of the ruffians through a jagged hole in the fence, and left him sticking there till he recovered his senses. In a moment the young man felt his arms released, and struggled to his feet, his late antagonist escaping by a plunge through the fence, and a desperate run across the fields, where he was followed by a flash and the report of a pistol, which failed to stop him. "Who fired?" said one of the shadows, now visible, a light active fellow, armed with a knotted cudgel. "I did, Matt," replied a voice that Antoine knew, as a thin spare old man came from the open space beyond. "Are you hurt, my boy?" he asked tenderly, approaching Antoine, who stared from one to another in amazement. "Pierre, Pierre Dobree!" exclaimed the young man. "You here, and these? How is all this?" "I will tell you presently," said the old pensioner, for it was he indeed. "I expected a trap, and had you followed by two lads that I could trust. Gave him a bodyguard of a couple of weaver lads, eh?" he said, turning to the rescuers. "You've done your work well, boys." "Why, we haven't been 3 years at sea and learnt the knack of the press gang for nothing, daddy," replied one of them, grinning. "But we must be off. We ain't constables, you know, and there may be trouble about." "Antoine, you shan't be disappointed of your ride in the cart," said Peter. "We must hasten, or your grandfather will be waiting supper. He will have to excuse me, though. Come in with you." The two shadows leaped lightly up, and one of them took the reins. "Stop, though," he said suddenly. "This isn't our cart. This will be brought in stealing. It might be a hanging matter, daddy." "I'm going to take it to the owner, if I'm not much mistaken," said Peter, as he and Antoine scrambled in at the back. "But, Pierre Dobree, what of Sarah? What of your niece? I must know. If she is in danger, and through me, I will brave my grandfather's displeasure, lose my hope of the fortune for which I care so little. I will. I must find her." "You can no more find her than I," said the old man. "One word with your grandfather, and then I go to seek her." "What? She has left home, then?" "Only this evening, and for an hour or two. But if my hopes do not play me false, we shall overtake the scoundrel who detains her, and he shall answer for it with my hand at his throat. But I will have her back." Pierre Dobree was ordinarily a calm, rather rosy, cheerful, high-dried old Frenchman, quite small and thin, and with a very perceptible stoop, but Antoine said afterwards that there was a very terrible look in this face just then, such a look as may have been born perhaps in the days of terror, when he stood in the crowd beneath the guillotine, and saw the head of Achille Dufarge fall into the sack. It was many minutes before old Anton Dormeur could clear his mental vision, or recover his senses sufficiently to determine that the girl who stood beside him, touching his shoulder, was real flesh and blood. But at last, with a strong effort, he roused himself to listen, and only half comprehending her hurried story, rose from the chair into which he had fallen. "And you, little one, who are you? What are you?" he asked presently, without taking his eyes from her face. "Your name is Sarah? It must be, shall be!" he exclaimed almost passionately. "It is," said the girl. "Sarah Rondeau." "Rondeau? Rondeau? Where have I heard that?" "It is my aunt. She is a weaver. We work for you, monsieur. See you not that this Monsieur Bashley having a spite against us, and against monsieur your grandson?" "Who and what are you?" again said the old man. "You talk as one of us, speaking of monsieur my grandson. Has he seen you? Do you know him? Your mother never saw him. She was Mon Dieu, what am I saying?" he added wildly. "Pray, pray delay not," said the girl, clasping her hands. "No, no, I come. First to the watch house, and then to your house, did you say?" And with a great effort, but almost without taking his eyes from the child's face, Dormeur strode to a closet behind the window, and took down a sword which he drew quickly from the scabbard. Sarah feared him, and retreated to the door. "What!" he said. "Dost think I'd harm thee, little one? Come, take my hand. Tell me, how did you get in?" "I found the street door unfastened, and knocked, but could make no one hear. Then I came in and listened, and there was a light up here, and so I came and knocked, not knowing what to do. But there is some one there now. Hark!" "'Tis the servants come back, child," said Anton. But he trod softly for all that, and turning about traversed noiselessly the long winding passage that led towards the back of the house. At the end of that passage the well staircase sent a cold grey gleam from the skylight in the roof, but down at the basement, where the lobby opened in the yard, there was a stronger light, the light of a lantern, by which a man stood impatiently examining a key, and picking it with a penknife as though it had been clogged. "I wanted to unlock that closet too," he muttered, "for I would swear he keeps gold there, but the cart will be here directly. It's rare luck that he should be out, and the women too, as I verily believe, for not a soul is stirring in the kitchen. Fancy leaving the house alone! I was a fool not to take the chance before." The sound of wheels aroused him, and Bashley, for it was he, gave a half frightened glance behind him, for he had suddenly become conscious that he was talking to himself. He looked upwards also, as though by some strange instinct, and there, leaning over the wooden balustrade of the well, their faces lighted in the gleam of his lantern, were Anton Dormeur and Sarah Rondeau, looking down upon him. He made a dash at the door leading to the yard, then suddenly turned and, with a desperate oath, drew a pistol and fired it from the stairs, but his aim was uncertain, and the ball went straight upward, crashing through the skylight. Another moment, and a door clanged open. A torrent of air rushed up the well, and amidst shouts and cries and the sound of falling glass, Bashley was smitten down and handcuffed between two officers who had been posted in the street, according to the instructions that they had received from Peter Dobré. The old weaver had not counted on such a success, but he had actually driven Antoine home in the very cart which was to have carried away the plunder, after having conveyed the young man to some place of imprisonment, where he might have died before aid could reach him. The first thing that Antoine saw clearly, when they had all got in the house again, was his grandfather carrying a woman in his arms. The old man had darted down the stairs at the moment Bashley fired his pistol, but Sarah had fainted. Poor child, she had been long without food, and her strength gave way amidst that awful scene. Arrived at the door of the room, the second thing Antoine saw was that this was the very girl whom he had gone out to seek. As she lay there in the great leathern chair, with a wan face and closed eyes, a keen anguish wrung the lad's heart, anguish not unmingled with utter amazement, for there, bending over her and kissing her hands, which he held gently to his breast, was the proud old man who had so rarely displayed emotion. Antoine covered his face with his hands, for his head began to reel. So Peter Dobré found him standing outside the half-open door, when he came panting up. Why, what's the matter, boy? You're not wounded, surely, say? Asked the old foreman anxiously. Antoine pointed to the scene within the room, and Peter stooped down and peered in. Well he might. Anton Dormeur was on his knees beside the child, moistening her lips with brandy from a teaspoon. It was a spoon that had fallen from her dress, but he knew nothing of that, for he found it on the floor without thinking how it came there. He spoke encouraging words to her, talked to her as men talk to babies, touched her forehead with his fingers, and took up one of her long fair tresses to press it to his lips. Presently she sighed heavily, and opened her great eyes upon him, then flushed, drew herself further back in the chair, and began to cry. "Pierre, Pierre Dobree!" shouted the old man, striding to the door. "He should be here. Where is he?" "Here I am," said Peter, suddenly confronting him and drawing Antoine into the room, all grimed and torn and smirched with mud as he was. "What is the meaning of that?" said old Dormeur, glaring into Peter's eyes, and laying a grip upon his shoulder that must have left a bruise there. "The meaning of that is," said Peter steadily, and looking back with an eye as fierce as his master's, "the meaning of that is that when nearly 19 years ago I stood under Saint Guillotine and vowed a vow, I meant to keep it. That when Sarah Dufarge, once Sarah Dormeur, my loved and lovely mistress, joined her husband, not by the guillotine, but by a broken heart in a little country lodging at Nogent, she left her child, that child, to the nurse who had been faithful to her, to my own good sister Nancy, who, bringing her to England when she and her husband came to escape the troubles, found her here another sister, the widow Rondeau, childless, to whom came as a legacy that same little orphaned one who lies now in her grandsire's chair." Anton Dormeur stood and glared for a moment at the undaunted little old man, who had thus kept a secret for 18 years, though he had been here in his service. But even in his bitter anger there came to him the recollection of the stern relentless temper with which he had blotted out his daughter's name from the family record, and with a drooping head, and tears that fell fast on his furrowed cheeks, he went again and knelt beside the girl, who now sat looking at them all with wide and wondering eyes. "Peter Dobree," he said presently, "go or send for your sister Rondeau. Antoine, dear lad, go you into the kitchen and see if anyone has come in, for we will have supper through all. And Sarah, Sarah, my child, my little one, you must never leave me more." "What? And are you, monsieur, truly my grandfather? And Monsieur Antoine truly your grandson? Then he is no, not my brother. What then? But I may kiss him?" said the wondering girl, as she stood in the centre of a talking group, apart from which stood the lad, who still looked at her wistfully enough. They broke into a laugh, at which she turned red as a rose, and with a sudden gesture, which shot a pain to the old man's heart, for it was that of her mother once again, turned away. "Yes, but you may kiss him," said Anton gently, and leading her to where Antoine stood. "A cousin's kiss, you know. Have you learnt what that is?" "No, I never had a cousin. At least, Antoine never kissed me," she said simply, and held up her sweet face to the young man, who bent and touched it with his lips. I do not think I need to say any more, but that is the story of the silver goblet, said our governess, as she rang the bell for the strawberries and cream. On the following evening the weather was so close and lowering that we had to remain indoors. It was one of those heavy days which sometimes occur in the summer months, when the whole atmosphere appears to be one low hanging cloud, enveloping everything in a kind of dark grey mist, that is only now and then pierced with red rays, and drops upon the distant fields in a straw-coloured vapour, the effect of the sunlight behind the atmosphere of mist. "What a dim, uninviting evening!" said Miss Grantley, as we stood at the window looking out at the garden, where the roses seemed to droop heavy, headed in the moisture-laden air, and the song of the birds was hushed, or only an occasional chirp was heard, as one or two thrushes flashed from amidst the plum-trees, or a martin twittered beneath the eaves. What a dim evening! It almost reminds one of a London fog, not a black fog, but a yellow one, such as one sees in the city sometimes on late autumn afternoon, or an evening in February. "Oh, do tell us a story about London, Miss Grantley. You must know ever so much of the streets and places there, or how could you have learned so easily about Spitalfields and all that? Beside, you lived in London, haven't you?" "Well, yes, I was in London for more than 2 years, and near the city too. And I think I must have spent too much time in wandering about some of the quaint old streets and lanes, where there are rare old churches, and halls belonging to city companies, and ancient houses that once belonged to noblemen of the court of King James and King Charles, but are now used for counting houses and warehouses, such of them as are not pulled down at least. I made some odd acquaintances too, and a kind old couple who were caretakers at one of the smaller city halls used to ask me to take tea with them, for the old gentleman had known my great uncle Joseph, who was an East India merchant, and belonged to the company that used to meet in the hall. I think the old gentleman said he had been the master, but at any rate his portrait was on the wall along with many others. And he was so like my dear father that I stood and cried, and often wished I could take the portrait itself away, but that of course was impossible. Here Miss Grantley became silent, and we could see tears shining in her eyes, till Annie Browers, who was standing near her, gently took her in her arms and kissed her on the cheek, and without saying a word held her round the waist. "Well," resumed our governess, smiling and pressing Annie's hand, "I was going to say that the old gentleman had kept a kind of diary or great memorandum book, in which he had written, oh, in such neat, stiffy, stalky kind of hand, all kinds of things that had happened among his friends and acquaintances for many years. He used to read it to me sometimes, and once when I had to stay there in the little cosy parlour for a whole winter evening because of a downpour of rain, he asked me if I should mind his reading to me a little story that he had written about a very strange occurrence to an old friend of his who lived in just such another lane, near just such another old hall in the city. He said that he felt like Robinson Crusoe sometimes, except that his wife was there with him in that quiet island of bricks and mortar. And, like Robinson Crusoe, he had learned to put his narratives upon paper in quite a remarkable way, so that if I didn't mind listening, he would read me a bit of a romance that was as true as anything I should be likely to get out of the circulating libraries. I said of course that I should like it very much, and so, while his wife sat on one side of the fire knitting, and I was half lost in a great leather easy-chair on the other side, the old gentleman took a bundle of papers out of a drawer in the bookcase, and read me the story that I am now going to read to you. for as I was very much interested in it, he was so pleased that he made me a low bow, and handed me the paper neatly folded and tied with a bit of red tape. He said it would be something to remember him by when I went away from London. End of chapter 2, part 2. Read by Lars Rolander.